you, co-prepare team, for inviting me for this lecture. So I will, as Rupam already mentioned, that I work on climate change adaptation with GIZ India under various capacities. And the work that I will be talking about today is focused on the concept of eco-village. So GIZ is working in different states of India on several aspects of not just climate change, but larger environmental and sustainable development issues. In Himachal Pradesh, we have been cooperating with the state government on developing climate policies, on demonstrating what does climate action means on ground, and also a lot on doing research studies on creating evidence of climate risk and climate vulnerability. So this particular project was part of this Indo-German collaboration in Himachal Pradesh. So I will be talking about this particular intervention on eco-village. This is the broad structure of my talk today, a little bit on the context of Himachal Pradesh general climate change concerns. What is the concept of eco-village? And what did we do in Himachal Pradesh? What was the approach? And what were the key lessons and results from the overall development and implementation? So before going to the Himachal Pradesh, I just wanted to take a little bit of time on the broader picture about Himalayan region. I mean, we all know that the latest report that has been released by the IPCC gives a lot of information on climate risks, climate variability and impact around the globe, and including the Himalayan region. And a major focus for Himalayan region, one can say that, is around water. So water has certainly emerged as a key issue, not just in the Himalayan region, but broadly. But for the Himalayan region specifically, because it mentions that water security is going to be an issue around the globe, and more specifically for the Himalayan region. The reason being that most of the water needs in the Himalayan region are met from natural springs and natural ponds and lakes. And even today, the rural Himalayan region does not have, like most of the region does not have a piped drinking water supply or even a basic irrigation infrastructure. And this is also complemented by the fact that slowly there has been a loss of traditional water systems in the Himalayan region, leading to a loss not only of the cultural values for the local communities, but also a decline in the agriculture production, and which is leading to in some places groundwater overexploitation and creating water insecurity in the region. This is certainly driven by climate change to a large extent, because there has been an increased rainfall variability with frequent heavy rains in the region, leading to more landslides, increase in average annual temperature, leading to glacier melts and the overall change in the hydrological regime of the region. There have been certain other impacts also mentioned, like, for example, invasive plant species expansion in the Himalayan region, changes in the spatial distribution of malaria, and also shrinking of habitats of certain species under different climate scenarios. So with this broad context of the Himalayan region that the IPCC talks about, I will take you to the state of Himachal Pradesh now. Himachal Pradesh is the northern state in India, which lies in the foothills of the Dhauladhar range of the Indian Himalayan region. It is a small state. However, the key economic sectors of the Himachal Pradesh are agriculture, forestry, tourism, and hydropower, and out of which agriculture contributes majorly to the state GDP, and 70% of the population is directly dependent on agriculture for their livelihood. Forestry, tourism, and hydropower generation are also economically important. Hydropower generation specifically because the state has a lot of perennial river systems. So there is already many dams in the state, leading to the economy growth in the state. So this is just a little bit on Himachal Pradesh, and you can see that it is largely has a mountainous terrain with elevations of 240 to 7,000 above mean sea level. So coming from the broad context of Himachal Pradesh, now coming to the policy context around climate, disaster, and SDG. So the state does recognize changes and impacts from climate change in the state, from disaster risk, and also has a certain vision for contributing to the sustainable development goals. So there are three key documents which give the broader legislative and policy context for these topics. The first one being the State Disaster Management Plan. The second one is a state level climate change action plan. And both these also contribute to a state level SDG vision document. And one thing which is common in all these three policy documents is that all three of these documents recognize climate and disaster related risk for the states. For example, increasing level of floods, hailstorms, cloudbursts in certain region and whereas droughts in the other regions, heat wave and cold waves combined with a change in crop and particularly apple productivity, because apple production is a major agriculture produce of the state of Himachal Pradesh, and also leading to increasing pests and diseases in the agriculture sector. And all these three documents not only recognize these risks, but also talk about strategies and actions that can be implemented for mitigating these risks. So now with this broader context, let's talk about what is the concept of eco-village, or why do we need an eco-village in Himachal Pradesh. So mentioned earlier that Himachal Pradesh is already facing a lot of climate change and disaster related risks. And combined with that, there are several other stressors in the state. For example, unplanned conversion of forest land, forest and habitat degradation because of forest fires or other human-made activities, habitat fragmentation, and complete unplanned infrastructure development, mining, and several other challenges. So considering these multiple stressors, which are only going to be exacerbated considering the future climate change projections and also environmental shifts, the state government has developed a policy called Eco-Village Development Plan with the broader idea of developing sustainable model villages, which can live in harmony with nature while also contributing to the aspirations of the local communities around development and a local flourishing economy. So talking about the concept of eco-village as such, the concept is not new. In fact, the first definition of an eco-village was given in 1991 by Dr. Robert Gilman, who is a sustainability pioneer, which talked about that it is a human-scale, full-featured settlement in which human activities are harmlessly integrated into the nature in a way that it supports healthy human development and can be successfully continued in the future. So this definition has not changed over the years, although the risks have exacerbated, and it still holds true for most of, not only in India, even in other countries. So based on these multiple stressors and the climate change impacts, the hypothesis around which eco-village is developed is that a sustainable use of natural water resources, proper management of irrigated water, adoption of sustainable agriculture produce, combined with clean energy sources, also effective solid waste management, forest management, and capacity building interventions can help communities progress towards a sustainable and also a climate resilient development pathway. And why are we talking about developing eco-villages at the local level? There are also certain benefits of doing such a planning at the local level. Because first of all, we know that climate change impacts, even though a lot of information is available at the global scale level, national level, even state level, but the impacts are generally very localized and very context specific. And there is also always a need of developing locally context specific solutions, not only for adaptation, but for the larger environmental protection. So by working on local plans which can contribute to sustainable development and climate adaptation, it gives the opportunity to develop very localized and locally appropriate adaptation solution. Secondly, there is a huge potential of pilot testing new solutions and also replicating in the local context. And third, as you know, that the government of India supports decentralized planning, and a lot of planning of different budgets and policies happens at the village level in India. So through this intervention at the village level, it also supports the government of India's interventions on decentralized planning and helping mainstreaming and integration of climate change adaptation in the local level. And the other important thing is that there are several development schemes which are implemented in sectors like agriculture, forestry, infrastructure by the state, but the convergence of all these schemes happens generally at the district level or at the village level. And this also makes a very good case for then working at this level, because it gives the opportunity to look at different schemes that are being implemented in a particular village or a district, and to see how adaptation and even some environmental activities can be integrated through the convergence of different funds and schemes that is happening at the local level. And lastly, it also helps in translation of not only climate, but also disaster and SDG priorities that the state has identified at the state level. because there are a lot of strategies that are part of these 3 documents that I showed earlier. But most of the time, it does not go to the granular detail of villages or districts where these strategies should be implemented, how it should be implemented. So working at the village level gives a very clear linkage with these state level strategies and how they can actually be showcased and implemented at the local level, addressing the local needs. So with this broader context of eco-village, the eco-village is developed around 5 main principles. Firstly, responsible natural resource management, basically looking at agriculture and water. Then secondly, a combination of traditional and modern practices, whether it is for infrastructure, whether it is for water conservation. I will also talk about it later in my talk. Then it convergence of resources from different schemes and policies with the overall objective of supporting the local aspirations, community aspirations, and also local self-sustainable economy, while at the time not forgetting the whole local participatory process. So working with the communities and the local government officials, and looking at the broader picture of how eco-village can actually contribute through these principles to the state level disaster, SDG, and climate goals. So before going into the how we developed the eco-village plan, what was the approach, I will just talk about general climate change projections in the state of Himachal Pradesh as a whole. So before we started working on the eco-village concept in the state, we carried out a statewide vulnerability and climate analysis, looking at the both historical climate trends and also future projections. So this was done in collaboration with different expert institutes in India. And some of the key inferences I've put down over here, for example, as far as rainfall is concerned, the analysis of rainfall trend in the state reveals a negative trend, which indicates that the total amount of rainfall has been decreasing over the past years. However, there has been long periods of dry spells combined with sporadic high rainfall days. So like less rainfall annually, but then falling over shorter period of days with higher intensity. And while talking about future, it also mentions that looking at the future scenarios of RCP 4.5, the rainfall is projected to increase marginally by the mid-century. And what are the impacts? So the major impacts of these changes are that it will lead to flooding in some areas, waterlogging in the other areas, moisture stress for crops, also the overall water quality deterioration, urban storms, maybe possibly rise in vector-borne diseases because of waterlogging and accumulation in some areas. Definitely a loss of work for people who are dependent on agriculture and activities and related activities, large-scale transport disruption, and also additional cost for repair of all the infrastructure. And similarly, looking at the temperature trends in the state, in the past, it has been observed that the mean annual temperature of the state is around 19.6 degrees Celsius. And the analysis shows both an increase in the maximum and minimum temperature. And this means that there has been an increased crop water stress and increased irrigation needs for the agriculture crops in the state. And while looking at the future, the temperature is projected to increase by about 1.4 degrees Celsius by mid-century. And the direct impacts of this will certainly be felt upon the traditional water storage structures, the traditional ponds in the state, the streams, which would result in less availability of drinking water, certainly less production for certain crops like apple, and also in case of livestock, less milk yield, and overall increase in the irrigation needs for the crops in the state. We also did a vulnerability assessment for the state, for all the districts of the states. So here you can see that this is the current baseline vulnerability of all the districts of Himachal Pradesh. And here are two projections for mid-century and end-century under two scenarios, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. So the vulnerability assessment was done based on the previous IPCC AR4 vulnerability assessment methodology, looking at exposure and adaptive capacity and sensitivity. And the indicators that were used for vulnerability assessment, other than the climate indicators, were indicators related to demography, infrastructure, economic indicators like per capita income and GDP, climate extreme indicators for exposure, climate extremes, and also agriculture indicators like crop intensity, yield, irrigation, fertilizer use, and also crop water stress, water availability. So using a certain set of indicators, a detailed vulnerability analysis was carried out, which showed results that although the vulnerability varies across different districts of the states, which is also dependent on the adaptive capacity and sensitivity of the each district. But if we look at the future, then we see that vulnerability is projected to increase for most districts of the state. And while looking at the key indicators which are resulting in this increase of vulnerability is basically because of exposure to rainfall variability, uh, exposure to extremely wet days or consecutive wet days over a certain period of time, and also consecutive dry days, an overall increase in the flood discharge, number of drought peaks, and the sensitivity to heat stress and seasonal crop water stress. So these were the key indicators that were increasing the projected vulnerability of the states under these two scenarios for mid-century and end century. Then we also did an analysis using certain hydrological models like the SWOT model on what could be the potential impacts on the key sectors of the state. For example, this is just a summary of the key impacts. There has been a shown that projected increase in the southwest monsoon and the northeast monsoon stream flow in the state. There will certainly be an projected increase in crop water demand because of higher evapotranspiration, increase in frequency and magnitude of floods, projected decrease in agricultural drought weeks, and extreme climate events like floods and heat stress will also have an impact on human health and livelihoods. Here you can just see the maps which talked about how these impacts will vary across different districts, basically around water yield, evapotranspiration, livestock heat stress, human heat stress, and drought occurrence and flood occurrence. And there are varying degree of, the impacts differs around different districts of the state, but more or less the issues for climate change and impacts on water sector are common for the complete state of Himachal Pradesh. Now coming to the eco-village development planning approach, with this broad context on Himachal Pradesh and what kind of climate and water stress the state is currently facing and is also projected to face, we followed a 4-step approach basically to develop an eco-village, starting with screening, which is looking at the whole state, defining certain boundaries, looking at what have been the past and future climate trends, which are the key areas or sectors that are vulnerable to climate change, followed by a very detailed analysis, looking at not only scientific assessment, but also a detailed community level participatory assessment of natural resources, of climate change impacts that the communities have observed, also engaging a lot with local government officials to see what kind of schemes are getting implemented in the region, and also then prioritizing action for implementation accordingly, looking at what are the local needs, what kind of resources are available, what is the additional resource that will be required in order to address those needs, and who will be the direct and indirect beneficiaries of the overall plan. And then this was followed by the demonstration and implementation on the ground. One of the key process that is important to follow throughout the approach is extensive stakeholder consultation, whether it is with the communities, whether it is with the local government officials, and even experts, research institutes who can provide information that is needed for developing solutions, for prioritizing actions, and even for implementation. So starting with the screening, we did what I talked about earlier was a statewide climate change vulnerability assessment with a focus on water sector, a detailed vulnerability analysis for different districts of the state, and also impact assessment for different sectors, specifically health and water. And here you can see that there are 12 districts in the state with different degrees of vulnerability. However, for the initial eco-village development plan, 3 districts were selected, which is Bilaspur, Mandi, and Shimla. Although these are not, as per this vulnerability assessment, these are not falling under the extremely high vulnerable category, which is lying somewhere here, Chamba district. But these districts were selected because of certain issues and challenges that the villages were facing, certain political priorities, and also political will. So looking at the detailed analysis after the initial screening, these are also certain impacts which are focusing only on these three districts, Bilaspur, Mandi, and Shimla. So all the three districts, it is projected that the magnitude of peak discharge will increase towards end century, leading to more floods. Whereas most of this increase in precipitation will return as direct surface runoff. Looking at the monsoon season, which is very important for the Indian agricultural community. So an increase in the precipitation is projected to increase towards mid-century in both climatic scenarios. So JJAS is basically June, July, August, and September, which are crucial months for agriculture, rain-fed agriculture. And in these months, the southwest monsoon is projected to increase. But however, it will not be a continuous increase, but more like intensive rainfall over shorter periods of time. So this will increase in surface runoff, contributing to stream flow, and with an overall decrease in the number of rainy days. So the crop water demand or irrigation needs will certainly not be met. And this is also combined with the fact that an increase in evapotranspiration to about 5 to 35% is projected to increase by mid-century. Coming particularly to these districts, both Bilaspur and Mandi are projected to have an higher increase in precipitation compared to other districts. And they are also found to be more vulnerable because of low surface water and groundwater availability in the post-monsoon season, which means that the irrigation needs are not met. And also there is a lack of irrigation infrastructure in both these districts, and also high exposure to floods and also droughts. So after these detailed analysis, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the ground perspective. So after the scientific assessment, a very comprehensive community level assessment was undertaken. So here we have one block development officer who was consulted in Himachal Pradesh. So block development officer is basically responsible for few villages, and he or she is responsible basically for planning out development activities in the region based on certain budget and priorities that are coming from the state level. But he or she also has the leverage to identify certain local needs and suggest changes or additional activities to be implemented as part of the budget that is received at the block level. So here you can see that he's talking about how changing rainfall and temperature has made water security a key issue in his block. Although these things have been happening since quite some time, but now he talks about how it needs to be addressed on a war footing, and in the future we have to do more than just what is expected of us in our jobs. So these kind of interactions are very important and also insightful from the sense that these are key, we can say, stakeholders at the local level who can bring about change and also support the implementation of activities in the state, contributing and building the overall resilience of the communities. Here we have another local leader, Panchayat Secretary. So Panchayat is the local, like the lowest level of governance in India. And she's talking about how climate change is impacting the village, how changes in rainfall and temperature can already be seen. And water security is certainly a major issue, and interventions are needed to safeguard water for all purposes. Then here are some testimonials from the farmers themselves. For example, one farmer is talking about whose farmland is near a river in Himachal Pradesh. The river is called Satluj. So the most of the farmland lies barren, and how the rising level of river cause erosion of his farmland every year, and they are losing the land to erosion every year. And he also talks about that if certain locally suited trees are planted, then it's possible to protect the farms for erosion. But then there are also a lot of lack of awareness or resources at the local level, which we found out during our assessment as to why such simple interventions are also not happening. Then the planting of, he goes on to say that the planting of trees is also expected to provide fodder for cattle, which can certainly provide additional livelihood opportunities for the people in the village. Here we have another testimonial from the ground. So she's talking about, she's basically an Anganwadi worker. Anganwadi is a local health center, a village level health center in India. And she's talking about how drinking water is supplied to households in our village through piped connection. But in the summer season, it's not very regular. and they have to walk for around 10 to 12 kilometers away from home every second day to search for drinking water. And in such situations, the villages do have some traditional water harvesting structures like baulis, which are traditional wells, but they have been ignored and not maintained for a long period of times. So she talks about that how the bauli near her house is damaged and the water is not suitable for drinking. So they usually now take their cattle for feeding them water from this bauli instead of consuming it themselves. And how water is becoming a scarce resource in the state, and but now the condition is getting worse every year, and water is not available even in the hand pumps, which basically draws water from the ground. So after these testimonials, I just wanted to go through one of the impact chains that was developed. So looking at both what the scientific data is telling us about what the community perception is talking about, we developed detailed impact chains. So here you can see that around two climatic drivers like low seasonal rainfall and increasing temperature combined with heavy rainfall for shorter periods of time and sometimes cloudbursts. So there is a chain of impacts that follow after this. This is based on both community perception and expert judgment. So for example, leading to water stress, drought, heat stress. This certainly leads to increase in crop diseases, damage to crops, also a lot of damage to house and other infrastructure. There are certain socioeconomic or sensitivity factors as well which contribute to this impact. For example, number of what kind of engineering material is used, absence of a certain building or infrastructure code, construction, unplanned construction in a region that is risk prone or exposed to certain climatic and weather variability. Then all these impacts certainly lead to failure of road communication. There is certainly an impact on evacuation, outbreak of diseases, leading sometimes to human casualties as well, loss of local flora and fauna, loss of crop diversity, in some cases migration to other areas. And the coping mechanisms is basically informal borrowing, loss of savings, selling of certain assets, also leading to higher incidences of poverty and also psychosocial stress and general health impacts. So several such impact chains were developed, and after several rounds of focus group discussions and participatory rural appraisals, several issues related to the sectors that are important for the communities were identified. So this is again from the community perspective, just the synthesis of all the outcomes. So the main climate change drivers coming from the community perspective were increase in temperature, intense shorter duration rainfall, drier winters, and also in some places reduced amount of snowfall. And these are the sectors that are getting affected when we look at soil and water, drying of natural streams and spring, severe surface water runoff, and also less population leading to less groundwater recharge, because of which the woman was also talking about how there is no water in the hand pumps. Also soil erosion, loss of topsoil, fertile topsoil, leading to increased frequency of landslides. Looking at agriculture, this certainly directly impacts agriculture a lot. Changes in agriculture production, complete washing away of agriculture crops in cases of extreme rainfall event, increased infestation by weeds and pests, and in some cases also abandonment of agricultural fields if they are no longer productive. Talking about forests, certain trees who have shallow roots seem to be dying, changes in flowering patterns of certain trees. Talking about health, increases in diseases that were previously not there, for example, diseases like malaria. Then infrastructure, heavy landslides and heavy floods damage roads, houses, and other public infrastructure as well, which leads to an increased cost in terms of both compensation to the communities, increased cost of repair. So these were just the analysis or the perspective that was coming from the ground. So looking at different perspectives and different issues that the communities and the local government officials identified, we also did a little bit of analysis as to what are the major factors that are still driving farmers to continue agriculture. So farmers from these 3 villages, in spite of all these changes, reported that farming does remain profitable for them, although investment in farming remains relatively high, both in terms of farm labor or inputs. There were no reported suicides as a result of production losses, and no participants had to sell land as a direct result of a recent calamity. But they do identify it as a potential coping mechanism in case of complete failure of agriculture production. Then majority of participants were also hopeful that their next generation will continue farming. Although most of the families that we consulted, there was at least one person who was in the service industry and also providing for the complete family. Agriculture remains to be predominantly rain-fed and subsistence-based in absence of irrigation, basic irrigation structure. There are few water harvesting structures that are placed by certain government schemes, but they are not in use due to lack of awareness or capacities on how to use them, how to make use of them, and how to use the water for irrigation or for other drinking purposes. So these are just some pictures from the ground, just to give an idea of what the ground situation is like. For example, here you can see that one of the dried spring is now used as a storage tank. So this is a dried spring in one of the villages, which has been concretized from all sides and is now used as a storage tank. So leaving no scope of its repair or reconstruction. These are traditional springs. So if one concretizes it, then there is no scope that it will act as a recharge structure and provide water for longer duration. Ultimately, the spring, if it continues to be like this, will dry after certain years, and it will only remain like a concrete structure, like you can see in this picture. That these are certain pictures of how erosion is impacting agricultural land in the villages. We also identified key soil erosion sites in the area through GIS and simple Google Maps. Some other issues that are like happening on the ground is basically unsustainable timber logging. One can see large amount of timber scattered across village. A lot of the area is also susceptible to fire, so forest fires are also a major concern in the region. Then coming to certain other environmental factors like absence of basic waste management system also leads to pollution of the existing streams. For example, here you can see a sewage pipeline directly draining into the river stream, so which pollutes the river stream itself, and also no waste management system for basic household plastic waste or agricultural waste. So based on these detailed ground level analysis and also what the projections and the scientific assessments tell us, we identified certain key drivers of vulnerability at the village level. Of course, there are several factors or indicators that can affect the vulnerability of the farmers or of the communities, but these were certain important drivers that can affect vulnerability in the sense either by increasing or decreasing. For example, when we look at demography, literacy rate or gender gap in literacy rate and number of healthcare centers was found out to be the key indicators of vulnerability. Talking about infrastructure, because biomass is used as a most important source for cooking in the villages, so it also impacts a lot the vulnerability of the communities that are dependent on it. Lack of access to clean source of drinking water affects their adaptive capacity or sensitivity. Lack of access to electricity as the main source of lighting, and also simple modes of communication and transport affect the adaptive capacities of these to a large extent. Then coming to the service industry, if there are more people who are employed in the service industry, then families were found to have more adaptive capacity because of secondary sources of income. Then gap in work participation rate or total participation rate, which is linked again to the service industry. Talking about agriculture, if there is more irrigation, then farmers will be less vulnerable in case of less rainfall. So percentage of net irrigated area to net sown area, what kind of fertilizer consumption is happening, what is the total food grain yield, and the percentage of land holdings below 1 hectare. Talking about economic indicators, lack of banking services and lack of insurance was found to be one major factor contributing to less adaptive capacity. Talking about weather patterns, extreme events like number of rainy days, extremely wet days, and consecutive dry days. So these three indicators had major impact on agriculture productivity, landslides, and the overall vulnerability of the region. And also water, because water is found to be the most important resource in the villages. The availability of surface water in both southwest and northeast monsoon in India. What is the groundwater availability? What is the crop water stress? And the frequency of drought and flood discharge. So these were the key drivers of vulnerability at the local level, which were important to identify so that they can be addressed through different actions, adaptation options, or sustainable development options through the concept of eco-village. So after these drivers of vulnerability, I just wanted to show one short part of this table on how different strategies or actions were developed. So after a thorough analysis from the scientific assessment and community level perception, so this is just one example of, for example, in case of high intensity rainfall combined with the incidences of drought, there are certain non-climatic stresses like land use changes, unscientific concrete structures, tree cutting, what are the sensitivities in the region, slopey terrain, which is prone to soil erosion, poor crop production, impact in the form of landslides, loss of productivity, soil erosion, and also indirect impact of reduced productivity and also less income. The existing coping strategies were mapped against these impacts, and we found out that there is a high dependence on local money lenders for credit. And there are also certain existing maladaptation strategies, for example, unscientific or just digging of bore wells to extract more groundwater, and in certain cases also using high input crop varieties which are not suited to the local conditions. So with this mapping, a long list of strategies was identified. These are just some examples like plantation of locally suited crop varieties on slopes for slope stabilization, certain soil water conservation structures, and also introducing resistant varieties which are suited for the local conditions. So with this detailed analysis, we also tried to perceive what are the community expectations for government support for basic adaptation interventions. And here you can see that majority of the communities wanted cheap seeds, which is basically access to seeds that they can sow in their fields. So 35% of the respondents wanted cheap or subsidized seeds from the government for agriculture production, followed by other subsidies, which you can see 15% for agriculture. This was followed by improved transport and other infrastructure, and also improved water infrastructure. So, and you can see then other options that the communities expected from the government are compensation in case of losses, better employment opportunity, financial loans in certain cases, and also insurance. So based on the community expectation mapping, what are the existing schemes that the government is already implementing? What are the challenges the area is facing? A long list of options was identified and listed, basically around these four verticals, looking at disaster risk reduction, adaptation, waste management, and renewable energy. And most of these interventions fall either under grey infrastructure, looking at basically construction of watershed management structures, for example, which can provide immediate benefit in terms of better water conservation or even irrigation structures, combined with green options, which is looking at more long-term interventions, for example, sustainable ecosystem and land management through maybe plantation and other ecosystem-based adaptation measures. And then also soft adaptation or mitigation options, which is basically training and capacity building and also awareness generations of the communities, of the local development officers. So after this long list of strategies, this is just one example of a eco-village plan from district Mandi of one village, Jhanjeli Baila. So one can see that the major verticals around which the activities were prioritized were springshed rejuvenation, basically looking at activities like trenching, check dams, creating a water security plan, and monitoring it regularly, looking at sustainable agriculture and horticulture, so promoting organic farming wherever it is feasible, crop diversification, promoting composting, and also crop rotations to include cover crops that can help building long-term resilience, and also providing access to farmers of weather monitoring systems so that they can change their irrigation or crop management structures based on agro-weather advisories. The third one was on water management and irrigation. So this was basically looking at rooftop rainwater harvesting structures, farm ponds, irrigation tank, also followed by revival of traditional structures. So traditional water harvesting structures and drip irrigation, which is basically an efficient irrigation technique. For soil erosion and landslides, the activities basically identified were better drainage system, erosion protection through anchoring systems and retaining structures, and slope stabilization techniques. Looking at renewable energy, there was the potential to implement like solar water heaters, solar street light. And from the forest management perspective, because the area faces a big threat of forest fires, so fire line management, also ecotourism site development was identified as one of the strategies. Planting of locally suited multi-purpose species on open forest land, and then also looking at the demand side measures, because a lot of communities still are dependent on biomass-based cooking, so promotion of fuel-efficient stoves. Then looking at the waste management side, because in complete absence of any waste management system, looking at options like wastewater treatment, source segregation, composting, reuse and recycling of goods and materials. So after this eco-village development plan around certain key verticals, we also try to analyze what are the possible barriers that the communities and the local government face, because all these activities, one can say, are not completely new, and a lot of government schemes also promote these activities, but due to several factors, they were not getting implemented. Let's say if you look at spring shed management and sustainable agriculture, so these are the possible causes. First, I'll talk about these, like low participation, low awareness, no technology, and no finances. So if we look at these components on the left side here, spring shed management or sustainable agriculture or water management, one can safely say that low participation and low awareness were the key barriers for all these components, in spite of the fact that in some cases there were certain rainwater harvesting structures that were made available by some certain government schemes. Whereas in case of renewable energy, there was a complete lack of knowledge of benefits and scope. In case of solid waste management, lack of concern and end-term measure. In case of sustainable agriculture, lack of knowledge of benefits of organic or natural or zero budget farming. In case of water management of irrigation, irrigation infrastructure is absent. Water storage structures are present but not used to their full capacity. And talking about forest produce, lack of knowledge of threats due to overconsumption, so unsustainable consumption for fuel wood, and also forest fires due to increased temperatures, and no ecotourism sites have been developed so far to enhance the income of the communities. So after this problem barrier analysis, I will just show one table which talks about what kind of activities were identified and how they were implemented. So looking at the water sources conservation and protection, I have removed the cost from this table, but I just wanted to show that how different departments or different schemes come together at the village level for implementing certain activities. So let's say activities like trenching or check dams are getting implemented through NREGA, which is basically a social security program of Government of India. Then plantations are getting implemented through the help of the Forest Department. And looking at some other structures like rooftop rainwater harvesting is getting implemented through the help of the Panchayat, which is the village council. Certain structures like irrigation tank are being done from the budgetary sources of Soil and Water Conservation Department. These are just few examples. Similarly, we mapped out how these specific activities around all the verticals of the eco-village development plan can be implemented through different existing schemes of different departments at the village level, leading to convergence and also mainstreaming of climate change adaptation into these plans and policies. So here is a certain list of impacts that these interventions have already given and will give in the near future, for example, a direct impact on community in the sense of improved health conditions, new livelihood options, also improved awareness, not just of climate risks, but broader environmental risks and what can be done, impact on livelihood through improved agriculture productivity, impact on ecosystems, reduced degradation of environment due to anthropogenic activities, also preservation of natural ecology and biodiversity in and around project site. And here, this is again one more testimonial from one of the resident of Eco Village, who talks about that Eco Village will popularize our village. The Swayam Sahayata group, which is basically women self-help group, will provide sewing training to the women of the village. This will help increase the household income and help in better livelihood. Also, the water scarcity in summers will be resolved by the proper water usage techniques and will help in irrigating the agriculture fields properly. Before going into the SDG impacts, there are certain other testimonials talking about the impacts. So here the farmer talks about that under the project or the Eco Village Development Plan, I raised the issues during the village meetings and the panchayat, and the concerned farmers joined me and we got approval for plantation on the forest land. The funds have been released by the district administration and we will start a plantation drive from June 2019. And here we have again the same farmer talking about that how through multiple trainings held by the project, I got the confidence to raise the issue in the panchayat. And now after discussion, we came to the conclusion that the traditional water harvesting structures need repair. The panchayat also approved the activity and released funds for the same. The Bauli near my house has the potential to provide drinking water to 20 households. So these are just few examples of how directly engaging with the communities also has the benefit of helping them to not just identify the risks that they're already facing. I mean, they are aware of the risks, but how to systematically talk about them in the local planning processes, giving a voice to their opinions and their needs, and actually getting things implemented through the panchayat or the local village council. So that was the one slide on impacts, and I will just talk a little bit about the lessons. So looking at this whole development and implementation and extensive engagement on eco-village development, there are 4 key lessons that I will just briefly talk about. The first one being evidence-based planning. So while working at the local level, it is important that the interventions are developed based on sound scientific evidence. So coming through scientific studies or literature, both green and gray, both scientific literature and gray literature. And then not just looking at scientific based assessment, but also looking at smaller scales. Like a lot of scientific studies are available only at the district level, but it's important to analyze data at smaller scales through engaging with communities, through engaging with local universities, local institutes, to identify what are the risks that are affected in a particular region and to devise adaptation and other measures accordingly. Then the second point is on identifying entry points in existing schemes and programs. So like I mentioned earlier as well, a lot of government schemes and plans have budget allocated to them and are sometimes implemented in a systematic manner, sometimes they are not. While we were working at the village level, we found out that in one particular village, most of the funds that were coming to the Gram Panchayat, which is the village council, were getting used for basically doing some small infrastructure work like road construction or certain small infrastructure here and there, which whereas looking at the risks and the climate change impacts, these funds could easily be channelized to other activities like doing a plantation drive of locally suited species or reviving the traditional water harvesting structures. So it's also important to identify points in the existing schemes and programs. This not only helps in using the budget efficiently, but it also helps in mainstreaming climate change concerns into the developmental goals of the plans that are already getting implemented at the local level. Then third point is on engaging with local communities and authorities for participatory planning. So extensive engagement with local communities is always essential because one can, I think, safely say that most of the time, the projected data, especially, which is available mainly up to the district level, the capacities to use that data, make inferences from that data, and also make it into actionable options is often limited at the local level. So in that case, it gets important that engaging with local communities through local authorities, also NGOs, it can play a big role in the sense to identify what are the local priorities, how to use this climate data, match it with the local needs and local perceptions, and devise adaptation options accordingly. And at the same time, it's also important to continuously engage with the local planning officers so that the options can be integrated into the local budgetary process, which happens annually. Then the fourth point is around leadership and key stakeholders. It's also important to identify local champions. It can be in the communities or local government officials, also the academia or NGOs who can really bring forward the communities together, who can also act as a model and take these actions forward. For example, in this case, we had different experiences, like if a local development officer or a block development officer is talking about taking certain measures, then he and she can also set an example for other villages. And also in the community, it's easy to mobilize certain activities. So leadership and key stakeholders is also always important for implementing sound adaptation and other environmental options at the village level. So that was the last slide from my presentation. Thank you.